The Third Reich was, above all else, a regime obsessed with control. It controlled what people ate, what they read, what they listened to on the radio, and what they were allowed to think. But perhaps its most intimate and disturbing form of control was over something that human beings have never been able to fully regulate throughout history: who they fell in love with. The Nazi state didn't just discourage certain relationships, it criminalized them. It turned love into a political act, and in doing so, it created a machinery of surveillance, punishment, and terror that reached directly into bedrooms, and to letters, into the most private spaces of human life. And yet, despite all of that, people still fell in love. Soldiers, officers, ordinary men sent to the far corners of a conquered Europe found themselves drawn to women they were absolutely forbidden to touch, to speak to romantically, or to build a life with. What happened to those men? What happened to those women? And what does this tell us about the nature of ideology versus human nature? This is not a simple story. It is not a story where all the victims are innocent, and all the perpetrators are monsters, though monsters certainly appear in it. It is a story about the collision between one of history's most brutal political systems and something the system could never fully exterminate: human intimacy. To understand what happened to Nazi soldiers who fell in love with forbidden women, we first need to understand the legal and ideological architecture that made those relationships forbidden in the first place. Because without understanding just how seriously the Nazi state took this, how much bureaucratic energy, how much violence, how much propaganda was invested in preventing these connections, you cannot fully grasp the courage, the desperation, or the tragedy of the people who defied those rules anyway. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were the foundation. Passed on September 15, 1935, during the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, these laws did something unprecedented in modern history. They legally defined human beings by their supposed racial category, and then prohibited relationships between those categories under penalty of law. The Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, that was its actual name, as if love between two people of different backgrounds was somehow a threat to a nation's honor, prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and citizens of German or related blood. According to historians Richard Evans in his landmark trilogy on the Third Reich, particularly in the Third Reich in Power 2005, the Nuremberg Laws represented the formalization of racial ideology into enforceable state policy, transforming abstract hatred into criminal code. But the Jews were not the only group targeted. As the Reich expanded, as German soldiers marched into Poland, France, the Soviet Union, the Balkans, North Africa, and beyond, the question of what a German soldier was allowed to do with the women of conquered or occupied territories became an increasingly urgent and complicated matter. If you find this subject as compelling as I do, the way history reveals the gap between what systems demand and what people actually do, then make sure you're subscribed. Hit that button now, because this channel goes deep into the stories that textbooks summarize in a paragraph, and we turn into the full picture. Now let's keep going. The word itself sounds clinical, bureaucratic, almost medical. Rassenschande, racial defilement, racial shame. It was the term used in Nazi Germany to describe sexual or romantic relationships between people of different racial categories as defined by Nazi ideology. And it was not just a social stigma. It was a crime prosecuted by the state, investigated by the Gestapo, and punished with imprisonment, concentration camps, and death. To understand how this worked in practice, we need to look at the documented cases and the scholarship that has analyzed them. Historian Bernhard Lezner, who was actually one of the civil servants involved in drafting the Nuremberg Laws, later wrote accounts that revealed the internal debates within the Nazi bureaucracy about exactly how to define these categories. Debates that were simultaneously absurd and terrifying, because they determined whether a real person would be considered fully Jewish, half-Jewish, quarter-Jewish, and therefore whether that person could legally exist in certain social spaces at all. Robert Schietley's work, particularly backing Hitler consent and coercion in Nazi Germany, 2001, documents how the German public actually participated in enforcing these laws through denunciation, reporting neighbors, co-workers, and even family members to the Gestapo for suspected violations. For Jewish women specifically, the danger of any association with a German man was lethal. If a Jewish woman was accused of having a relationship with a German man, she could be sent to a concentration camp. The man, if he was a civilian, could be arrested, imprisoned, publicly humiliated, or sent to a camp himself. But what if the man was a soldier? What if he was wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht, the SS, or some other branch of the Nazi military apparatus? The answer varied, depending on the status of the man, the nature of the relationship, who found out about it, and when. In the early years of the regime, enforcement was inconsistent. In the later years, particularly as the war intensified and the regime radicalized, the punishment became more severe and the investigation more systematic. Historian Nathan Stoltzfus, in his book Resistance of the Heart Intermarriage and the Rosenstrasse Protest in Nazi Germany, 1996, documents cases of mixed-race couples, Germans married to Jews who faced extraordinary pressure, including the arrest of the Jewish spouse, and how in some documented cases, public protest actually led to the temporary release of some detainees. It is one of the few documented cases of civilian protest affecting Nazi policy, and it centers precisely on this question of forbidden love. But let's be precise about what the Nazi racial hierarchy actually looked like in terms of who was forbidden to whom. It was not only about Jews. The system had a hierarchy of racial categories, and the rules governing sexual and romantic contact between them were layered and complex. At the bottom of the Nazi racial hierarchy, considered subhuman in Nazi ideology, were Jews, Roma Sinti and Roma peoples, black individuals, and Slavic peoples. Though Slavic peoples occupied a complicated and contested position in Nazi racial thinking, as historian Mark Mazauer explains in Hitler's Empire, How the Nazis Ruled Europe 2008, these categories of people were considered racially incompatible with Germans, and relationships between Germans, and these groups were considered the gravest form of Rassenschande. Then there were intermediate categories, the various peoples of Western Europe, whose racial classification was debated within Nazi ideology. The French, the Dutch, the Scandinavians. These groups were sometimes classified as Nordic or Aryan adjacent, which created a different set of rules for German soldiers stationed in, say, France versus Poland. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what happened to soldiers who fell in love with forbidden women, because the category of forbidden was not uniform. A German soldier who fell in love with a French woman occupied a fundamentally different legal and social position than a German soldier who fell in love with a Jewish woman or a Polish woman. The former might face bureaucratic disapproval and career consequences. The latter could face execution. Nowhere was the collision between Nazi ideology and human reality more violent, more tragic, or more complex than on the Eastern Front. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, in Operation Barbarossa, it sent millions of soldiers into a territory populated by people that Nazi ideology had classified as racially inferior Slavs, Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians people, the ideologues in Berlin considered subhuman, fit only for exploitation or elimination. And yet, those millions of soldiers were still human beings. They were lonely, frightened, far from home, and living in conditions of extraordinary violence and deprivation. They encountered women in occupied villages, in forced labor camps, in the countless situations that occupation creates. And, despite the ideology they had been fed since childhood, or in many cases since their teenage years in the Hitler Youth, some of them formed attachments, relationships, and in some cases genuine love affairs with women they were officially supposed to regard as racially inferior beings. The Wehrmacht's own orders on this were explicit. In 1941, orders were issued prohibiting sexual contact with the local population in the occupied Soviet territories. These orders were reinforced by SS regulations, and by the explicit ideological framing of the Eastern Campaign as a racial war. A Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation in which the people of the occupied territories were not to be treated as human beings deserving of normal social interaction, much less love. But here is where the historical record becomes both fascinating and damning. Historian Omer Bartov, in his groundbreaking study, Hitler's Army Soldiers, Nazis, and War, in the Third Reich 1991, documents the way Wehrmacht soldiers simultaneously perpetrated atrocities against the civilian population and formed intimate relationships with local women. The coexistence of these two realities, mass murder and personal intimacy, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the history of the Eastern Front, and it reveals something important about the nature of ideology. It is never total. It never fully colonizes human psychology, even in the most totalitarian of systems. What happened when a soldier's relationship with a local woman was discovered? The outcomes varied enormously. In some cases, commanding officers looked the other way, particularly if the woman in question was classified as Slavic rather than Jewish. The prohibition on contact with Slavic women, while officially enforced, was practically acknowledged to be widespread and not always prosecuted with the full force of the law. Historian Regina Miller and others who have studied the German military justice system of World War II have documented that sexual violence against Eastern European women was both widespread and systematically under-prosecuted by the Wehrmacht's own military courts, a pattern that historian Birgit Beck analyzed in depth in her work on the Wehrmacht and sexual violence. But relationships, actual emotional attachments, actual love affairs, were viewed differently, and sometimes more harshly than simple sexual assault, in one of the most perverse inversions of moral reasoning imaginable. A soldier who raped a Soviet woman might face minimal consequences. A soldier who fell in love with one and tried to protect her, live with her, or marry her could face court-martial, demotion, imprisonment, or worse. Because love implied equality. Love implied that the woman was a human being worthy of love, and that was ideologically unacceptable. If the situation on the Eastern Front was brutal and complex, the situation regarding Jewish women was something else entirely. It was, in the most literal sense, a matter of life and death. For Jewish women, being the object of a German man's desire, even unwanted desire, could be a death sentence. And for German men who genuinely cared about Jewish women, the act of expressing that care could destroy them as well. Historian Claudia Kunz, in her landmark work, Mothers in the Fatherland, Women, the Family and Nazi Politics, 1987, traces how the Nazi regime constructed a specific role for German women in the racial state as producers of racially pure children, and how this ideology cast Jewish women as a particular kind of threat to the racial order. Jewish women were simultaneously sexualized in Nazi propaganda, depicted as seductive corruptors of German men, and dehumanized as subhuman beings unworthy of any protection. This double positioning made them uniquely vulnerable. The legal framework was clear. Sexual relations between a Jewish woman and a German man constituted Rausschande under the Nuremberg laws. Both parties could be prosecuted. In practice, the prosecution was highly asymmetrical. Jewish women faced the brunt of the punishment and were typically sent to concentration camps. German men faced imprisonment, but the punishment varied based on their status, their connections, and the nature of the relationship. There are documented cases, some of them heartbreaking in their specificity, of German men who tried to protect Jewish women they loved and paid terrible prices for it. Historian Wolf Gruner, in Resistance in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and other works, has documented individual acts of resistance and protection within the system. Victor Klemperer's diaries, I Will Bear Witness, published in English in 1998, document from the inside what it meant to be a Jewish man married to a German woman, Eva Klemperer, who was not Jewish, and how that relationship both protected him and made both of them targets of relentless persecution. The Klemperer case is particularly well documented, precisely because Victor kept meticulous diaries that survived the war, giving us an intimate, day-by-day account of what it meant to live inside a forbidden relationship in Nazi Germany. But what about soldiers specifically? The Wehrmacht, and particularly the SS, had their own systems of monitoring and punishment. An SS man who had a relationship with a Jewish woman faced not just criminal prosecution but ideological disgrace, a violation of the very identity of the organization he belonged to. Heinrich Himmler, The head of the SS was obsessed with the racial purity of his organization and personally oversaw cases of SS men accused of Rassenschande. Court-martial records from this period, analyzed by historians including Michael Burleigh in the Third Reich, A New History 2000, show cases of SS men prosecuted, demoted, and imprisoned for relationships with Jewish women. What makes some of these cases almost unbearably poignant is the evidence that some of these relationships were genuine, that some of these men, despite everything they had been taught, despite the ideology they had sworn to uphold, fell in love with women they were supposed to consider subhuman, and in doing so, they created a kind of living refutation of the ideology itself. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden history of World War II is something that matters to you, and I think it should matter to all of us, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below. Tell me, do you think human beings can ever be fully controlled by ideology? Because the evidence from this period suggests the answer is deeply complicated. Let's talk about it. Your perspective matters, and these conversations make the channel better for everyone. The situation in Western Europe was markedly different from the Eastern Front, and the differences reveal a great deal about how Nazi racial ideology functioned in practice inconsistently, pragmatically, and always in service of power rather than principle. When Germany occupied France in June 1940, it entered a country that Nazi ideology classified very differently from Poland or the Soviet Union. The French were considered, in the confused and often contradictory taxonomy of Nazi race theory, as a mixed people, partially Nordic, partially Mediterranean, and while they were not considered fully Aryan, they occupied a much higher place in the racial hierarchy than Jews, Roma, or Slavs. This meant that relationships between German soldiers and French women, while officially discouraged, were not treated as the criminal Rassenschande that relationships with Jewish women were. The result was a massive and complicated social phenomenon that historians have studied extensively: the widespread sexual and romantic relationships between German soldiers and French women during the occupation, which lasted from 1940 to 1944. Historian Fabrice Virgili, in his important study, Shorn Women, Gender and Punishment in Liberation France, 2002, documents what happened to French women who had relationships with German soldiers after liberation. The brutal public shavings, the humiliations, the mob violence that was inflicted on an estimated 20,000 women in France. This post-liberation punishment tells us something important about how these relationships were perceived. They were seen as collaboration, as betrayal, as the ultimate form of surrender. But what were these relationships actually like? The historical record is complicated. Some were clearly coercive. The power dynamics of military occupation made genuine consent deeply problematic in many cases. Some were transactional women, in desperate circumstances, trading proximity to German soldiers for food, protection, or safety. And then some, the historical evidence suggests, were genuine romantic attachments, mutual and complicated, between individuals who found each other across the lines that politics had drawn. Historian Philippe Burin, in France under the Germans' Collaboration and Compromise 1996, estimated that approximately 200,000 children were born of relationships between French women and German soldiers during the occupation. These children, sometimes called children of shame after liberation, faced their own devastating consequences, and their stories have only recently begun to be excavated by historians and by the children themselves, many of whom searched for their fathers for decades after the war. For German soldiers in France, the consequences of these relationships were much less severe than what their counterparts on the Eastern Front faced. Military authorities sometimes turned a blind eye to relationships with French women. There were cases of German soldiers who married French women, or tried to, though this required extensive bureaucratic approval and was often denied. The general attitude of Wehrmacht command in France was pragmatic: suppress the most flagrant cases, ignore the rest, and focus on maintaining order. But there was a crucial exception that transformed everything if the Frenchwoman turned out to be Jewish. France had its own Jewish population, and many French Jews had been assimilated into French society for generations. Some had family names, appearances, and social positions that made their Jewish identity non-obvious to a German soldier who met them. If a German soldier fell in love with a French woman, and then discovered, or was informed by a denouncer that she was Jewish, the situation transformed instantly from a socially awkward but tolerable romance into a potential capital crime. Historian Susan Zuccotti, in The Holocaust, the French, and the Jews, 1993, documents the complex ways in which French Jewish women navigated the occupation, including the extraordinary measures some took to hide their identity, obtaining false papers, moving to the unoccupied zone, or relying on the genuine protection of non-Jewish friends, neighbors, and, in some documented cases, German soldiers who knew the truth and chose to protect them anyway. The most morally complex dimension of this history is the documented cases of German soldiers and officers who used their position to protect women. They cared about women who were Jewish, Slavic, or otherwise classified as inferior by the regime they served. These cases challenged simple moral narratives without excusing the broader system of which these men were part. The historian Mordecai Paldiel, who for many years directed the Department for the Righteous among the Nations at Yad Vashem, has documented in works including Saving the Jews, amazing stories of men and women who defied the final solution, 2,000 numerous cases of German soldiers and officials who used their positions to save Jewish individuals. Some of these cases involved genuine emotional attachment, soldiers who fell in love with Jewish women and used their authority to shield them from deportation. These cases put the German soldiers involved in extraordinary danger. If discovered, they faced court-martial for dereliction of duty, for violating racial laws, for betraying the ideology of the regime. Some were discovered, some were punished, some were killed, and yet, and this is what makes these cases so important to document, some succeeded. Some managed to protect the women they loved through a combination of cunning, official position, and extraordinary risk. One of the most well-known cases in popular culture, though it is often simplified, is that of Oskar Schindler, not a soldier but an industrialist, though deeply embedded in the Nazi system. Schindler's motivations were, as historian David Crow documents in his definitive biography, Oskar Schindler, that untold account of his life, wartime activities, and the true story behind the list 2004, complex and shifting. He began as an opportunist and ended as a genuine protector. His case is important not because it was typical, but because it demonstrates that even individuals embedded in the system had choices, and that some made the choice to protect rather than destroy. Less famous but equally documented are the cases analyzed by historian Klaus Michael Malmann and others in studies of German police and military personnel in the occupied East. These studies reveal the full spectrum of behavior from enthusiastic perpetrators to passive bystanders to the rare individuals who used their positions to protect specific people, often at enormous personal risk. What happened to soldiers who were caught trying to protect forbidden women? The severity of punishment depended enormously on who was doing the catching. If caught by a Wehrmacht commanding officer who was willing to be pragmatic, a soldier might face a reprimand, a transfer, or a demotion. If caught by the SS or the Gestapo, particularly in the later stages of the war, when the regime was increasingly radicalized and increasingly paranoid, the consequences could be far more severe: court-martial, imprisonment, or, in some documented cases, execution. Historian Ben Shepard, in Hitler's Soldiers, The German Army in the Third Reich, 2016, provides systematic analysis of the Wehrmacht's military justice system and how it handled violations of racial and ideological laws. His work demonstrates that the system was neither perfectly consistent nor perfectly brutal. It was, like most human institutions, variable, subject to the personalities and priorities of the individuals who administered it, and shaped by the broader context of the war's progress. As the war turned against Germany after Stalingrad in early 1943, after the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the regime's internal enforcement of racial ideology became simultaneously more desperate and more savage. Men who might have received a reprimand in 1941 faced death sentences in 1944. The closing years of the regime were characterized by an intensification of internal violence, directed not just outward at the racial enemies, but inward at Germans who were perceived as insufficiently committed to the ideology. Before we go into the final chapters, which I think are the most important ones, I want to say something directly to you. If you've made it this far into this video, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. You're not here for the easy version of history. You're here for the truth, even when it's complicated, even when it's uncomfortable. That means a lot. If you haven't liked this video yet, now is the time to do it. Not because I'm asking you to be nice to the algorithm, though that too, but because it's a signal that this kind of serious, source-based history content is worth making more of. And I intend to keep making it. Now let's finish this.